Hey everyone, and welcome to An Operator's Blog. This episode is specifically for startups in the US India corridor, and today we will be discussing how to really leverage curated events to drive go-to-market in the US. I really wanted this episode to be about best practices, about tactics, about really the nitty-gritties of this subject. So it gives me immense pleasure to have with me a team which I have personally seen execute really well on this strategy in the last 2 years in the US. So joining me today is Nivas and Nitya from the marketing team at Spendflo. For those who don't know, Spendflo is a US India startup that helps companies to understand and optimize their SaaS spends. Nivas is driving marketing there, and prior to this was driving marketing and partnerships for multiple products within Freshworks. And Freshworks, of course, is one of the largest India SaaS stories out there. And Nitya is driving growth marketing for Spendflo in the North America region. And before this was with MadStreetDen. So super excited to have both of you with me. Nivas, if I can begin with you, can you tell us a little bit about Spendflo? And in particular, what is the go-to-market strategy for the company? And how do curated events really fit into that strategy?
Hey, once again, thank you so much for having us over, Samitra. So Spendflo is a SaaS spend management platform that typically helps companies optimize their SaaS spends, right? Since 2021, the post-COVID era / the SaaS boom, a lot of companies have started using a lot of SaaS applications. And how we come in and optimize their usage, they manage their usage, and as well as just ensuring contract right sizing and things like that. We typically work with mid-market companies. Our primary market is again in the US. So we typically work with mid-market companies greater than 200 employees all the way till early enterprise, if I were to call it. And so for us, we realized this is not an established category, right? Like I think prior to this, I was at Freshworks, where most of the times we went after established categories, or like the playbook in India was mostly around how do you go after established categories. But I think Spendflo is going after a lot more nascent category, and we're probably one of the first few companies in that category trying to solve this problem. We realized we don't have a lot of search volume or intent happening, right? Like we really know the persona. So we sell to CFOs and finance leaders. We know the persona, but we don't know their intent. So when this problem occurred, I think that's when we realized we had to play the brand game a lot more consciously and with intent, right? I think our Google search ads did not scale. A lot of other channels that traditionally scale for companies that sell from India to the US scale. Ours, it did not, right? So we had to look into other channels of operation. And then that's when we realized, hey, events is a great channel, because if you also think about it, because we're selling to the CFOs and the decision makers, you have to build trust, right? Like they're not necessarily going to click an ad or look at an email and be like, yes, I'm going to buy your product. So we realized we had to build a lot of trust with them. So in-person events kicked in really well. Anything that targets the persona really well, right, are things that are working very well for us today. And today, I think I've been with Spendflo for about 2 years, and now the motion has evolved so much that a lot of the other channels have started kicking in.
This is really interesting. So I think what I'm hearing is that one, I think in any startup which is looking to create a category where the category is not established, I guess events have been really working very well. And Spendflo is, I think, a good example of that. And then second is, I think, trust building. If you're selling to CXO level decision makers, your product is that zone, then I think having that in-person touch point with customers really helps.
Right. I think mostly when you know the persona better, rather than not, if you don't know the persona, it's going to be tricky. If you know the persona, it works.
Yeah. And Nivas, that's, I think, very interesting, right? And I think Spendflo, I think you took that call pretty early, I would say, relatively in the life cycle of the company to really go this route. And right, as an investor, I actually always get a lot of pushback when I speak to founders that, hey, are we too early for this? We don't have the resources. What's going to be the ROI? What do you think is that right stage, right? And it could be either in terms of traction or financing or any other vector. What's that stage where founders should really start exploring events and really investing into curated events as a viable GTM strategy?
I think seed still works from a funding standpoint, right? Like I'm not going to say, oh, you need to wait till Series A to do this. We did it when we were at seed. Probably once we got our Series A, we accelerated it, right? Like, because for obvious reasons. I'm not really going to talk about from a funding scenario, but more from a, hey, being ready for it. I think a couple of things. I had actually written a LinkedIn post around if you are a founder or a head of marketing exploring events for you for your GTM strategy. I think a couple of things, right? Like just like focusing on your ICP really well, where if it's limited to one or two ICPs and not, if you're selling to 4 or 5 personas within the company, then you're going to have struggle keeping the topics and the discussions and probably even the events a little uptight, right? So that's one. The second, again, very dependent on from an ACV standpoint, right? Like if you're selling SMB deals, which is less than 25 grand, I wouldn't recommend, because just basically from a unit economic standpoint, but if you have deals that are going up market, right? Like even from 15, 20, it's jumping 25, 35, 40, 50, and not the whatever, right? Then it makes absolute sense. The third, I think, is to just understand if your persona is someone who wants to attend events, right? Like, or who wants to network with other peers. If they are again, finance leaders are not the perfect example for people who to attend events, but they genuinely want to network with other peers and learn from them. And they don't necessarily sell. So that's the beauty of it. If you are targeting salespeople or marketing people, they're obviously trying to market to other marketers or sell to other salespeople. But in finance, they're just literally there from a peer learning standpoint, and they really, really appreciate that. The other two factors, right? I think I have Nitya with me, where if you don't have the team to execute it, and it's a very ops heavy game, right? Like in the beginning, it's the first few times you try to crack an event is very hard. And most of the times I see founders / marketers giving up at a very early stage. That's one. And I think also just the sales motion, which is sales leaders or the founder or anyone within your startup who's ready to support that motion, right? Because again, it's an ops heavy game. You cannot say, oh, I'll only travel a particular way, or I'll only attend events a particular way. You're going to have some level of salespeople at these dinners as well. So we've gotten lucky with both aspects. I think a great team from a marketing standpoint, as well as great support from a sales leader / sales team standpoint.
I think, Nitya, I'm sure you have a lot of on-ground learnings on this. In fact, I remember, I think this whole podcast came out of a discussion that Nivas and I had almost 2 years back during a SaaS Boomi mixer. And actually, I was asking him, I was really grilling him on, okay, what's the budget? What's the ROI of these events? And I think one thing that since then I have noticed is that, especially if I think founders and startups, where the teams are predominantly in India, they tend to get intimidated by even the cost structures. Whereas actually it's a spectrum. So you can decide based on your resources, based on your ACVs, the kind of persona who's going to come in, what's that kind of experience that you want to offer. A lot of that is actually very flexible. And you can be smart about it. You can be hacky about it. Nitya, any thoughts on that? Yeah.
No, definitely. I think that's a great question. I think you faced that really well, right? I think even when it comes to us driving traction for some of these or curating them, we like to think of it at least in terms of on-ground execution, in terms of two different buckets, right? Like one is the ops and the logistics side of it, and the other is probably going to be the demand gen, right? So I think with respect to the first, it's all about just identifying where you want to start off, what cities you should be targeting. This could either be where most of your customers are sitting, but where a big part of your active pipeline is, or even where a big part of your target audience is, right? And there are tools for instance, I think when we started off, we used just Sales Navigator to get some of that information, right? So that was one of the first things that we did right off the bat. And then I think it also helps to steer clear of low footfall days. For instance, because we cater to finance, we know the days around an annual close is probably when everyone's really busy, right? And they probably don't want to come out and step out of what they're doing for a networking event, right? So days like that, the end of a quarter, regional holidays. I think we also learned the hard way that Mondays and Fridays are terrible days, to host these things, right? Spring break, which can again differ from region to region. So these are all things that I think you can rule right off the bat. So just eliminate some of those uncertainties, some of the things that could possibly yield to a poor result, right? And I'd say the other thing is also reduce as much friction as possible. Ensure that the location is central, it's accessible, right? If people are going to be ending their day at, let's say, a 5 p.m., don't host something that starts at 7:30, right? or don't do like breakfast that starts so late that you would have to rework their entire schedule just to fit this in. So I think just being considerate of their schedules, their lifestyles, that really helps, right? In terms of demand gen, so some of the channels that have been working really well for us is again just been email and LinkedIn. We haven't poured a lot of money in trying to secure sponsorships on newsletters and things like that to get the word out there. I think those are again they've been like lean channels for us to function. And honestly, there are a lot of these local groups and chapters that kind of crowdsource events that are taking place and send like weekly, bi-weekly roundups. So I think these are like great channels to leverage and just put the word out there. And the other thing is also to make sure you have some kind of a draw, right? This could either be a keynote speaker or an experience that they don't get on an everyday basis, right? Like maybe it's dining at a Michelin grade restaurant. Maybe it's wine tasting, right? It's things that they don't normally get to do. So or sometimes it's even just anchor guests, as we call them, right? Like someone who's just really pushing the envelope, I think, in their field. Those are things that kind of help draw and attract a lot more of the people who are going to be coming in. And I think finally, the last thing I'd say is ensure there's like consistent communications until the day of the event. When someone signs up, let them know what to expect, right? Let them know if there's going to be parking, let them know who might be coming and joining them, right? What to expect in terms of the agenda. I think just removing some of these uncertainties really helps put together a good experience for them.
Yeah, those are, I think, some great tips. And I think your point around the low footfall days, that just reminds me, over the last 1 month, I've been chatting with a lot of my own portfolio companies, and a bunch of them are looking to plan Bay Area trips. And I'm telling all of them, don't come around July 4th. Summer is a bad time. People are going to be out. They're going to be on holiday. Kids are off. School is off. People have summer camps, a lot of stuff going on. So I think these small details matter.
Definitely.
I want to spend a little bit of time on the roundtable format in particular. And this is more from the outside because I've been observing your US GTM journey over the last 2 years. It seems like that's a format that you have almost zoned in on. It seems to be very structured, repeatable. It seems to be working in terms of results. What was the journey behind actually narrowing down this particular format? Because it could have been a mixer, it could have been webinars. You can do a lot of different kinds of things.
I think we've had a fair share of learning. So we definitely, I think one of our very first events was a mixer, right? And then we had, I think, like 30 odd people attend, and this was like around SaaS talk. Some of the reasons why that didn't work out for us is just that everyone's there purely for networking, but there is no common theme that you can just go and start a conversation with someone, right? You probably get like the 3 introductory things out of the way, and that's it. And for us, we still look at events today as a demand generation channel. We look at something that we can pass on to sales, that they can nurture, and that can bring in pipeline, right? So when you don't have, I think, memorable things to go back and connect with them on after the event, it's hard to even have them explore the possibility of looking at Spendflo, right? So I think in terms of those kind of keeping that in mind, roundtables worked well because we'd always kickstart with an icebreaker. We asked them about their challenges. We tried to understand them more. And we also brought in curated focus groups of, let's say, 12 to 15, right? Where we're able to build a meaningful relationship or a connection with them compared to having 40 people there and we probably just speak to 6 of them and everyone else is untouched, right? So I think that way, this was something that really worked for us. No frills, just people there purely with the intent to network, to learn. That was something that worked for us.
I think what we also realized was, given the higher seniority that you take them, right? Like they don't want to necessarily. Also, they've had a long day. If you think about it, like from a mixer standpoint, I'm just going to talk about different formats, right? Like we've done all 3 of them, say mixers / fireside chats or sessions and roundtables, right? So when you talk about mixers, they've had a very long day, and also, you cannot have a 30 people mixer and try to have meaningful conversations. Nitya pointed it out really well. So we decided to keep it a lot more lesser and more curated, lesser people and more curated. And we decided to do dinners was the format, right? Like dinners or maybe lunches and like the roundtable conversation. And also, I think trying to avoid sessions, one was just the lack of venues, because if you had to pick a venue and go after it, it becomes very expensive. And also just coordinating agenda, coordinating a lot of things just became very tricky from like an execution standpoint. But also one thing that we realized was the audience who shows up for a session is probably one level below the speaker, right? So if we're going to have, say, a CFO of a Series A company, you're going to have VPs and directors of Series A, or probably, but we wanted most of them as CFOs CFOs or VPs of finance. So we didn't want to also hurt their ego, right? Like when you generally keep one person as a speaker, like a keynote speaker, and say, hey, you're going to listen into this, sometimes they'll be like, oh, okay, I'm not lesser than this person. So that ego kicks in. So we decided to avoid that. Even today, we do have one, like say, prime person, right? Like where we start off conversations with that person based on certain conversations. But when you keep it a round table, it feels like, hey, everyone's equal. And just that we've had a conversation and he seems to have some interesting learnings from it. And that's what she or he is going to be sharing. That model worked pretty well for us. And we decided to it was a lot more, I think, just operationally quicker. So we just decided to keep it with it. We still do. It's not that we shy away from mixers or sessions, just that whenever we've found an opportunity, we've picked whichever format works for that city/that day.
Yeah, it almost sounds like the roundtable format. You're not optimizing for leads or you're not optimizing for traffic. You're optimizing almost for engagement and trust. And these smaller settings where you can actually have meaningful dialogue and also people enjoy themselves. I'm sure this, in a way, is a reflection of the product strategy as well. It's a reflection of the kind of check that this person has to cut or build consensus around internally. So everything has to almost be in sync for this to work.
I think it's also this, not necessarily that everyone's just going to be like, oh, okay, yes, I came for your dinner and I'm going to be like, I'm going to sign up for your product or I'm going to reply to your email. Not necessarily is everything very closely tied. We've had people go and talk really well about us in communities saying, oh, yes, I like, for example, we had a prospect reach out to one in a community, which we were actually not part of. And he asked, hey, what's a good SaaS spend management tool? And though one of the folks was never a customer, said, you know what, I've not had a consensus within the company to adopt Spendflo. But if I were to start today, I'll look at Spendflo, right? Not necessarily did we do business with the person, but just that we said, hey, we're nice people. I think also the fact around, especially in mid-market and enterprise, people buy from people, need that trust. People need to see, okay, you know what, you're nice people. Let me do business with you, because it's a long-term relationship. It's not going to be like just a 6-month contract or a 3-month or not even a year, right? Like it's sometimes longer than that. And you have to put that grind for that to happen.
Nitya, coming to you, I'm sure that you have a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotes from hosting these events. I know you've done some crazy number of these roundtables and a lot of faux pas, a lot of things where I think the team thought something and something else happened. Can you share some interesting anecdotes, stories, and also in hindsight, what are the learnings that the team has taken away from some of these stories?
Yeah, I don't even know where we should begin. So I think we've done over like 45 of these since November of 2022. And I think we've had our fair share of learnings, experiences, stories, whatever you will, right? Just looking back at some of them, I think, yeah, like one of our recent events, right? So for us, less is always more. That's been like the name of the game. So we always co-market and some of these events with a partner. And let me tell you, like the devil is really in the details. Like we did an event recently between 3 partners. We split responsibilities. Someone's owning up the landing page, doing promotions. Someone's coordinating the venue, right? And it just so happened that the event was booked under one of their names while the event was promoted by all 3 of us. And we had people showing up and asking for that particular event. But then since it didn't really like match with the name on the books, they were like turned down or said that this isn't really taking place there. So I think when you have like multiple partners involved, even just something as simple as what name is the booking under, right? Or like when you have folks attending, what do you ask at the front, or who do you go to once you arrive at the venue? Who's there to show you around? So just like over communicating, right? Sharing the details of people who are like on ground, sharing like phone numbers, contact information, just anywhere that they can, like anyone that they can reach out to for like immediate support. I think that's been like a huge learning. Over communicate as much as you can, right? And I think like Nivas and I have this really funny story of some of our first events. We did something in SF and then in New York at the Marriott Marquis. We picked like the fanciest restaurant in the fanciest place. And because we thought that's what financiers wanted, right? We're bringing in a CFO. We've got to give them, the creme de la creme. We've got to give them like the best treatment possible, right? I think we blew like somewhere around 15, 16,000 on each one of these events. And you know what? Turns out like no one really wanted that. And a couple months later down the line, we did a smaller event with one of our partners and it was just like held in their office and they had pizza. And people loved it because they were just there to meet other people, they were just there to learn, right? No one wants those extravagant displays. So I think that's where we learned to pull back.
I think the first few events, right, like where we realized we thought, okay, you know what, we have to do it at a 5-star hotel and with a great view, with everything, right? Those are good to have. Not that they're not, right? Like, but those are definitely not gonna like scale from a unit economics standpoint, especially, right? Like it depends on the ACV as well. If you have like $1 million ACV, great, go for it, right? No harm in it, or a $500,000 ACV, go for it. I think two instances that I not very fond of it, but I remember is in Chicago, it was apparently the hottest day of Chicago, right? Like we didn't realize. We were like, whoa, why is Chicago hot? And coming from Chennai, and I was like, dude, why is Chicago hotter than Chennai? Like out of say 17 people who had agreed to come and accepted calendar invites, only 4 showed up. And we were like shocks. And I think we had more people from say us and the other partner that we are partnering with than the number of attendees. I think the lesson there was not to overcommit on the minimum with the restaurant, right? Like we lost a lot of money that day with the restaurant. And we've done a couple of these things, right? Like where we've lost money to the restaurant and we've found a way to probably get like wine bottles priced 7x from what you buy at say a Walmart or a Costco, but give it to the prospects and just keep them happy. I think the more recent one, even after doing all these number of events, this happened in New York. Nitya and I were there, and the event starts at 6 o'clock where people start showing up, and I think it was 6:05. And the nervousness always kicks in, right? Whatever you've done, right? Like how many ever events you've done. At 6:05, I was like, shit, okay. I was just joking to Nitya saying, Nitya, if you're going to have 5 or 6 people show up, I'm just going to leave, right? I'm just going to go back and like crash because I was having a really bad jet lag that day. And I was just joking to Nitya saying, okay, you know what, Nitya, I'll just let you manage. And because I have probably could call it a withdrawal syndrome. It's hard, right? It's not easy to pull off such events and ensure. I remember like a friend in New York seems to get he's not even like a decision maker or anything. He's like at a very junior level position. And he seems to receive like 12 to 13 invites to events on a weekly basis. And he's like, dude, I don't go to any of these. I don't understand whether I should go. What's the value prop? So that's how much is happening in some of these cities in SF and New York. So you got to be careful about how you position your events and how you execute them. So it's hard.
Yeah, and I'm sure I think that over 2 years, I think that's the institutional knowledge and muscle that the team has built. And I'm sure that this in the medium to long term actually can also be a competitive advantage for a startup because it's hard. That's precisely the reason. Yeah, you said something very interesting about the attendees that come for these events, the roundtables. One of the learnings was that they actually want to learn, right? It's not about the great wine or food. Of course, that I'm sure nobody minds it. But the key thing is learning. So how do you drive that?
I think Nivas mentioned this somewhere during the conversation where no one's really there for a session as well. They're there to learn, right? But if you're going to make them sit through, let's say, an hour-long session after a whole day of work, that can be something that's like really draining, right? I think they mentally check out at some point as well. We try to focus on just like learning from each other's collective experiences. I think like iron sharpens iron, like no one else can speak and attest to that better than their peers, right? So what we try to do is bring together like companies of similar stages, right? Like CFOs who are probably going through a similar journey together, right? And our intent is mostly just to foster that conversation, put that seed in and see what really comes out. So most of our events they revolve around a particular theme. We're talking about something that's top of mind, that's pressing for them, but we don't dictate the conversation. We'd have an icebreaker and then we ask them for their thoughts. And that usually leads to more people and towards the end of it, the sharing like challenges that they're facing, where they need help, right? And these are not like things that you can probably just go Google somewhere, or like there's no playbook for some of these. There are no ebooks that you can download that are like answering like these on-ground real-world problems. So I think it really helps when we bring them together to just talk, and then we just take a step back, listen in, learn as much as we can, and then bring that home.
I think I want to come back, Nivas, to something that you said earlier, where it's a lot of times in these kind of events, it's hard to straight away tie an event to an actual outcome, like actually a deal getting signed. And I think especially at the early stages of a startup, this is one of the big dilemmas or pushbacks on using events is the attribution problem. I'm actually really curious at Spendflo, how do you track the ROI of these roundtables? And what needs to happen post an event? for actual outcomes to get driven by the sales teams or product teams? What's that post-event stack looking like, and how do you make sure that is actually tied to outcomes?
I think we were very clear from day one that we're not going to be doing this just from a brand standpoint. Again, at a seed or a Series A company, we cannot be doing events from just pure from a brand standpoint. Brand does happen automatically. A lot of the activities, if you think about it, brand kicks in as part of it. But so we were very particular that, hey, this needs to drive pipeline, right? So we kept sales accountable with us. We drove a lot of the conversations post the event as well to ensure that this is helping in a couple of formats, right? Like one, if we knew that there are a lot of existing prospects in a particular city, we decided to go after the prospects, net new pipeline or net new leads that we could generate. We also leveraged events from a deal acceleration standpoint whenever we felt, you know what, we could genuinely bring someone in and have them just like a good time with one of the AEs that's probably working on the deal. And we also used this from a customer advocacy standpoint, where we did bring in customers in some of these dinners and ensuring that they're able to share some of the best practices and not necessarily just say, oh yeah, you should buy Spendflo. That's not the intention there. But they're like, hey, okay, you know what? You're already a customer. We're doing these for prospects. Why not have you as well, where you could also share your learnings and probably get learnings from the others. We were I think today, early days, right? Like when you're trying to build this as an engine, you got to be very, I think, laser sharp focused on, hey, how many people attended? You got to also ensure that the type of people, based on if they attended, if you had a good conversation, or if they didn't, have like very different types of conversations with your team, right? If it's going to be like the same set of sequence where you just put them through a sequence like 10 days later and just be like, oh yes, can you convert into just pray to God? That's not going to happen. So we were very particular about, so we are very focused in that way, where we immediately look at, okay, who all did we have a conversation with, who all just attended, but we didn't get to have a conversation with them, who all said, hey, they're either interested, they're not interested, and who else did not show up. So based on which we had like a very good, not just a sequence, but like a lot of sales follow-up techniques that we did. Well, again, if we were a way larger company and we had a lot of competitive advantage, I'll tell you what we're doing. But again, I'm just gonna, with due respect to the team that's doing it, I'm not going to be sharing that side of. But this mostly caters to this captures the crux of it. And I think the one honest thing that I've noticed with most of these events is just being yourself at some of these dinners, right? Don't put a fake face in most of these dinners. And for example, I'm a marketer, I'm not a finance leader. So I never try to be the finance expert or as if I am going to lead the conversation. And in most of my dinners, I've announced saying, hey, folks, by the way, I'm a marketer. I'm just here to enable the conversation. I have zero understanding. And I'm probably going to be asking the most dumbest questions just so that I also learn. And in fact, the one thing that when you become a lot more vulnerable, they open up a lot more and they'll be like, yeah, we understand, right? And we don't get what you do. So initially I was genuinely worried that, okay, I'm going to sound so dumb in some of these dinners. But now having done these, I think I mostly moderate most of the dinners that we host. And it's been fun, honestly. I've learned a lot interacting with the finance leaders.
Yeah, I think honestly, just to add to what you said, Nivas, I think when you're doing it as a founder, as a marketer, you bring in that unique perspective to that conversation, right? Compared to just it being all finance. So
yeah, no, I think it's very non-trivial for a seed to Series A startup to actually do this. And I think it requires a deep organizational buy-in as well and a cultural buy-in. And I think it has to start really from the founders to, I think, every function really coming together. Because at the end of the day, I think, Nivas, to your point, a lot of these impacts, some are measurable, but a lot of them are not. And at the same time, you cannot say, hey, this is ATL and people don't have infinite budgets at that stage of running a startup, and that to cross-border. So I think having that organizational buy-in and having that coordination cross-functionally to really make sure that the maximum outcome is being generated out of this. It sounds like that's actually super important.
It is. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. No, this has been an amazing chat. I want to wrap up with one final question. I think both of you, beyond Spendflo, you're also very deep into the US India SaaS ecosystem. Both of you have, even before Spendflo, worked for some top startups there. And I know you have cracked the roundtable, so you're roundtable experts. But I want to now stretch your imagination a little bit. If, let's say, all the founders in the US India corridor are going to be listening to this podcast, what are some of the event formats or strategies that you feel are yet unexplored that you would actually encourage a lot of the US India founders and even like their teams to look at?
Yeah, no, I think that's something that's really interesting. And like you said, like at this point, even we're trying to think of how we can expand or different things that we can bring to the table, right? And a lot of this learning also comes with partnering from the right kind of people, learning from their experiences as well. So I think one of the things that we noticed is that maybe not every one of these events has to be even like this mid-scale, or they don't have to revolve around dinners, right? For instance, we've seen teams just take like their top like 3 prospects, right? Or like top 4 companies that they're probably pursuing and bring them to a baseball game and have a conversation over that, right? We've seen people bring in multiple stakeholders from the same company, not just restricted to that one decision maker, but then more people to just get that foot in the door in case a conversation lags somewhere. You've always got another champion within the company, right? So I feel those are some of the things that they've leveraged to go deeper into like penetrating some of these accounts and be more strategic with it. So I think that's something that's definitely interesting.
I think we'd love to host a lot more experiences. Just that when you're trying to again experiment and with experiences, you're going to need a little more leeway around failing without worry, right? One thing that Nitya and I were just randomly talking about is, hey, you know what? We've never taken them to a sushi restaurant, right? Just as we've not taken that sort of a risk, right? Like I think every single thing is a risk when you want to probably do, say, golf, or we've even thought about, hey, should we all, I do a lot of fitness related things. And I was like, why don't we get all the CFOs to have Barry's or maybe one of the CrossFit sessions? And I was like, okay, do they really want to appear very sweaty among their peers? Like, so there's so much we can potentially do, like that you probably do with your friends or colleagues, but you can do with finance leaders, just that they need to get to that comfort zone. And they should be like, okay, what Spendflo puts together, or anyone, any brand for that matter, puts together these experiences, right? I think the most riskiest, not riskiest actually, alcohol is a lot more easier to do kind of experiment with. So we've done cocktail mixing, wine tasting, whiskey tasting, some of those things. I've seen companies do a lot of axe throwing competition. Golf is a big deal in the US. And there are a lot of other things that has happened, just that also only when you get to do it once or a couple of times, or when you see another partner taking the lead on that front, you know the nuances of it. So maybe we're still away from those nuances today. And once we get there, we'll start experimenting a lot more formats.
And Nitya, just going back to earlier in the conversation, I know you were talking about partners, right? So it seems like you have some collaborations going on when you are organizing these events. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What's the reason behind choosing a partner? What kind of companies are these? What are some of the learnings there on that front?
So I think this was something that we started off, I think, from our very first event, right? Like almost every one of our events is always driven, hosted with a partner. That came out of a couple of different reasons, right? Like one is less is always more. How do you do the most with the least amount of like resources, right? Because we were a pretty lean team as well. So we're like, hey, how do we split costs? How do we split resources? How do we piggyback off each other's brands as well? It's some of these brands are a bit more established compared to us when we were just emerging. And like when someone receives probably an invite to a Spendflo event, they're probably going to be like, who's Spendflo? Like, unless you have that draw, right? Like they're probably just going to discard it. But if it's a brand they're a bit more familiar with, they're open to the idea of at least understanding what this is about, right? So that was something I think that was very critical for us to be able to piggyback off their brands or seem more legitimate. It also helps that we can learn from one another's experiences, right? Early on, like we were doing a lot of these things for the first time. So it helped when we had people that knew the game, right? They've done some of these things before, or they could even just help with some of like the cultural nuances, help us understand city-specific nuances, right? If certain localities work better than the others, right? So that amount of detail, I think those are things that we could like definitely rely on them. And that took the edge off us as well, right? Like we're like, we'll do what we do best. We'll focus on our strengths and we'll let you pick some of these. So when we've identified partners, they're just typically companies targeting, I think, a similar audience, similar stage, but we don't directly compete with one another. So we're just trying to understand how we can tap into each other's networks and make the most of it.
I think this is a very smart way of both optimizing costs, making sure that the entire ecosystem gets built. I think there's more value for attendees because they can get to learn about two products in one event. So I think really, I love this. I love this strategy. Nitya, Nivas, I think this has been an amazing conversation. I think this is a topic that's of real operating importance to a lot of startups out there, particularly ones that are based in India. And of course, everyone is trying to crack the US market. And I really appreciate that you have been very candid and really opened the kimono on a lot of this stuff. And I think this is knowledge that's hard to get anywhere else. So thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.